Hi guys, welcome to sprint 28 of Dogen. As I explained, yet again this is another sprint that we spent most of our time really covering refactorings and internal work, and there is no user visible changes, but that's just to be expected. That's actually part of the target at the moment, really, to try to minimize as much as possible user changes, or user visible changes, should I say. So in this release notes, we're going to basically give a quick overview of the work that was carried out in the sprint. The work was kind of in two phases. The first phase, which is prior to the stories that I'm talking about here. Perhaps I should increase this a little bit. So in the first phase, what we did is we mainly concerned ourselves with what we actually wanted to do, which is not sure how much we can view this. There's nothing in between, so I'll go for 100%. What we really actually wanted to do is to start to make use of the properties we have in the PMM, the physical meta model, that give us the components to compose a path. So things like the part properties, the backend properties, the facet properties, and the like, and as well as, of course, the physical model, which contains details of the artifacts. And that was what we wanted to do. We did do a couple of stories on this topic, and we tried very hard to get our head around this, but we were struggling quite a bit to try to compose these paths in the right way, and there was a lot of problems with the physical model. And every time we have a problem with the physical model, we then have to go into the guts of the code generation. So if I go up to here, and then what we need to do is we then need to start modifying things such as the templates that generate the code. And it's actually quite a hard thing to do if the changes you're doing to the templates is completely divorced from the current code. Oh, this is a dollar sign, actually, looks like a dodgy S. And so what we were doing is we were struggling really to make these changes, because every time we tried to change something, it took us such a long time, and then we couldn't really test things properly. So we had a moment of enlightenment, and this comes our first story, which is to move the C++ locator into the physical model. So now what does that mean? Well, if I take a look at how the C++ model looked in the previous sprint, let's go back to 100. In fact, I'll even go as far as saying, let's just go to 75 for a second. So you see there is the whole of the formatables namespace in one of these technical space specific models. So you can see here, formatables still has a ton of stuff, right? And all this stuff you see here, it really shouldn't be here, because I mean, there is no such thing as formatables, really. Particularly, there's this class here called the locator, which had the responsibility of composing paths, and it was used by things like the inclusion expander to generate the directives. It was also used by the file and path card expander. So there are several users that had that made use of the locator, and the way the locator worked was each of the formatters, as we used to call them, what we now know as archetypes, was providing a path. So you'd call the formatter for a path, and the formatter will call the locator. So all of these types you see here, all of them were bound to the locator, and internally they called the locator. So there was this really complicated relationship where we had to initialize the locator correctly. There was all sorts of factories and so on, and then we'd have to supply the locator into each of the formatters, and then the formatters will give us the path, and then these guys here will call the formatters, and all of that was really complicated. So what do we do then? We changed all of that to a much simpler view of the world, where in the physical model we have a transform called the legacy paths transform. That transform internally contains a locator with very much the same logic. I mean, it was quite literally a copy and paste job. The only difference is that where the locator was obtaining data from whatever it was obtaining data, it's now using the physical model as a source of data. And where we were calling externally the locator to obtain the paths, we changed it so that internally this transform loops through all of the physical meta model elements and then dispatches the right call to the locator. And the right call is, as you can imagine, copy and paste from what was inside of the formatter. So we didn't really do anything very clever. We did something really simple. Even then it was still very complicated. But it enables us to now, all that complexity was scattered around a very large number of classes in here, should I say, is now self-contained into that locator transform. And what we can now do is we can create a paths transform, which is not legacy, and this will actually not be based in the locator at all, but will be based on the new classes that we have that provide us with the data that we need. So you can see it's just a one-to-one mapping. In this transformation step, we just have to compare the output of that against the output of that, and if they're the same, then this guy succeeded, and if they're not, then we can just figure out why they're wrong. So this is much simpler way of looking at the world, and what we've done with this is to decrease the size of the formatables model quite considerably. Excuse me. So as you can see here, by the end of this sprint, pretty much all of the classes that had to do some work with the locator were decommissioned, and we are literally down to just the helpers, and so the formatables model looks much cleaner. So that is the locator into the physical model. Now, of course, we didn't just have the locator inside of the formatables namespace as you've seen. There was all sorts of other classes here. Some of them were closely connected to the locator, some of them weren't, such as artifact properties, test data properties, facet properties, standards, all sorts of bits and pieces. So this story was basically the mop-up exercise that followed the removal of the locator. We basically divided this exercise into 3 steps really. The first step was the locator, which is by far the hardest. The second step was the mop-up, and the third step, which will happen next sprint, will be the helpers. And they're all kind of self-contained, so I'm hoping that's not going to be anywhere as near as complicated as what we've done so far. But that was the gist of this sprint really, was just this desperate struggle to get rid of formatables. And once we get there, we can really start to look at the LPS as a whole, rather than this LPS that we have at the moment that's scattered across lots of different models. Other than that, this sprint had a lot of media commitments, as I called it in the release notes. We had a very interesting, very challenging presentation we did for the Angolan Programmers Association, which was quite good. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much to the APA guys for inviting me. And as well as we did a very long series on the formatables refactor. Still trying to get a head around how to best make use of this recording of coding. We're finding it quite useful. It's certainly a driver, but it does distract you a little bit. So if you're doing something complicated, particularly when we go back to the data-driven work, I'm not sure how much we can record, if I'm honest. But we'll give it a go and see how that goes. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for this sprint. Thanks very much for watching.